Created and now. No, yeah.
I've been asked about Dom and stuff like that before. And
Yeah.
I've been asked about discussions before. Dom, JQuery. But I gotta focus on.
Ice cream cakes are better than normal fries. My mom can give me something.
You could do a taste test of salty, but you're not. They are not.
I don't know what those guys are talking about, but it's like something weird. Yeah. I couldn't tell you. We've got like the calm side of the room and the like crazy side of the We are, yeah. Yeah. We are. All right. Welcome back, folks. You guys are gonna have to tidy up the discussion on salty crackers and like return to the real world. Okay. Yeah. I don't know what's going on over there. All right. So.
I don't know how.
All right. So on Monday we started talking about JavaScript, and I'm kind of a bad news first kind of guy. So on Monday we just talked about all the terrible things. about JavaScript that you should never do, because they'll appear to work, but then they'll like get you later. But today we're going to be talking about good things. So we're going to finally be talking about stuff you want to do in JavaScript. Okay? And what's what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using a library called JQuery to do manipulation of the web page the user is looking at. So before we dive into the library itself, let me give a quick preliminary of why we're using this library called JQuery. It starts in the deep mists of time, which I think is like 2008, right? And back in those days, browsers were like totally incompatible with each other in a lot of ways. So there are a lot of APIs that were just different browser to browser, Internet Explorer and Firefox, so like totally different ways of doing the same operation. And like a lot of stuff was missing from one or the other. So like Firefox had this support for this thing called XPath, which like was missing in Internet Explorer, which was useful for some things. But then like Internet Explorer had these things called ActiveX controls, which provided their own like weird collection of features that weren't available in Firefox. And basically back in those days, you'd use a good JavaScript library just to like make the different browsers behave somewhat reasonably. And that's kind of a lot of the value that jQuery provides. Basically, those built-in browser APIs to manipulate the web page. At first, they were different on different browsers, which was a big pain, and the browsers had lots of bugs. And then second of all, the APIs were just kind of bad. So like, for example, you'll see this in a second, but the name jQuery for this library comes from the stack that allows you to query the page for elements that match a CSS selector. And like, this is definitely something the browser knows how to do, because you can write CSS, and the browser at some point figures out with the elements the tool wants to. But there wasn't an API exposing this feature. So like jQuery as a library offered this feature to you by basically re-implementing. These days, a lot of the browser incompatibilities have luckily gone away. Browsers are much better today at mostly matching each other's behavior. And all of the best APIs invented by these libraries, like the query API, eventually got added to browsers. So for example, if you go to the jQuery, if you go to a web page that has jQuery, I'm going to use the jQuery website, which obviously uses its own library. You have this function called $. And I don't know why I tabbed complete this, probably because I used it in a previous, because I used it in a previous example. Well, let me do something simpler. There's this $sign function, and you can call this $sign. Yes, $sign is a valid variable name in JavaScript. Why? Don't know. You could call this $sign function, and you can pass it a CSS selector. So here, if you recall back to your CSS selectors, like this pre-midterm, this is a selector for all links, A tags, that are inside paragraphs, P tags. And if I run this function, I get out an object, which is kind of like an array, containing all of the matching elements. So you can see here that there are 16 matching elements. And like, here's one. This is a link inside of a paragraph. And another, I know it makes a big rectangle, but just means the words our blog. And here's another one, and so on and so forth. So this is a convenient function that lets me get all of the links inside paragraphs on the web page. I guess the rest of these are like in the footer somewhere. Somewhere. Yeah, they're down here in the page. Okay, so this is a convenient API, $sign, and as far as I know, like an API like this was first offered by Prototype, where it was called $sign, and then jQuery's like big claim to fame was that it made this the main way that you access the web page. Nowadays, there is a built-in function not offered by a library, just built into the browser that does the same thing. It's called document.query selector all. So I can pass it that same selector, and it will provide the same list of 16 elements. So, to some extent, the need for libraries like jQuery is less, just because the browsers offer this feature built in, and so there's no actual need to use a library that can, correct for bugs in the browser or whatever. Because browsers mostly implemented and mostly implemented correctly. And then there's still some sort of issues to paper over. And I also just wanted to give you all some JavaScript library to use, because I'm gonna teach you essential skills like importing libraries. And then finally, the actual built-in browser APIs, you can just tell they're like, man, look at this name. Document.query select for all. That's pretty long. So it is convenient to have a shorter version of it. So back in the day, jQuery is super useful, paper over browser incompatibilities and so on. These days, that's sort of less of a use. It's less important just because like the browser compatibility is really good. Some of the APIs have been replaced by better ones. And so all in all, these libraries are less important. I still want you to be familiar with them. First of all, you'll see a lot of jQuery out there in the wild. This was a really popular library like 2008 and 2016. There's still some areas where the browser APIs are bad, and I'd rather not teach you the bad, scary browser API and just teach you like the nice jQuery one. And they're easier to remember just because they have like better names and so on. So that's the pitch. Anyway, so we're going to be using jQuery homework 6, and today I'll be introducing you to the library. Okay, so that's my quick intro as to like where are we learning this. You know, nowadays a modern JavaScript application, if it's starting from scratch, would probably use something like React or Next.js or, you know, I don't know. I guess Angular is no longer possible, no longer popular, but still maybe. Right? I would love to teach these libraries, and in 4550, Aaron does. But you gotta need some familiarity with JavaScript first. So we're starting here. And if you're interested in kind of modern front-end frameworks, then you should take 4550 with this stuff covered. All right. Cool. So let's begin. So in the browser, when you're running JavaScript, there is something called an HTML element hub. And I can show you that. Here is an HTML element object. It prints like this in the JavaScript console, and you can hover over it to see where it is on the page. But its type is HTML. And this has a bunch of useful APIs. Like for example, if I set the if I get the .id field, you see it auto completes here to an empty string. And if I set that to like, boop, now you see that this HTML element has actually gained an attribute called boop. And that's actually nice because you can also have some CSS that like looks at this attribute. Or I could do remove, and that deletes the element from the page entirely. And if I wanted to, I could do this kind of ugly thing, which is like, let's select this element. Yeah, this copyright paragraph. And so now I have this copyright paragraph object, and then I can create a new element, which is like, I don't know, document create elements button, and text content equals click me. And so far what I've done is I've created a button with the contents click me, but it's not anywhere on the page yet. It's just a button floating in space separated from the page. And then I can do append child e. And now you see that the button has appeared on the page. So the point is, one really important kind of object in JavaScript that you deal with a lot are these HTML elements. And these represent things on your web page itself. By calling methods or modifying these HTML elements, you make modifications to the page itself. And the reason we want to do that is if we want to do something like show a dropdown when you hover over something, or change something about the page when you click a button, then one of the steps there is like change the web page as a result of user action. We'll talk about the user action part in a second, but you can use these built-in browser APIs to change the page. So again, we have these HTML element objects in JavaScript, and they have methods on them that let you modify the page. You can like read and write fields on the object and then change the HTML attributes. You can also add or remove and modify elements. So those are the built-in browser APIs. And again, we're going to try to avoid using them just because they're sort of ugly and kind of confusing. And I don't know, I want to teach you jQuery. So in jQuery, it provides this core function called $. And what $sign lets you do is it lets you wrap an HTML object and produce this jQuery object. The jQuery object is like, kind of represents that HTML element, but it offers a bunch of useful methods on it. So here's like the easiest version of this. We have this HTML element object P. And here I'm going to create a jQuery object out of it. And here's what that ends up looking like in the console. First, you get this bizarre thing where it says ce.fn.init. I don't know what that means. You can ignore that. And then you see that this object contains your HTML element at position 0, and it's an array of length 1. So these jQuery objects, they represent one or possibly multiple HTML elements, and then they offer a lot of convenient functions like here I can call this text method, and this will get all of the text inside the object, including the click me that we just added with our button element. So there's this $sign function, and the very first thing it provides is it allows you to wrap an HTML element into a jQuery object. And as you do things with jQuery, you're going to want to keep track of which things are wrapped elements that are jQuery objects that you can apply the jQuery methods to, and which ones are unwrapped, because basically the only thing we want to do with them is wrap them. But there's a couple of built-in browser APIs where you need to provide unwrapped HTML elements. So basically, we're going to have two types of elements, wrapped and unwrapped. And you're going to have to keep track of which one is which. Mostly you'll be using the wrapped ones, but it's really easy to, have an error where like a certain method doesn't exist. And that's because you're calling the method on an unwrapped object instead of a wrapped one, or vice versa. The way we typically distinguish these is we name the wrapped ones with a $sign and the unwrapped ones without a $sign. So you would typically do something like let $P equals this. And again, I want to note $, totally valid part of an identifier. In JavaScript, this is just a normal variable name. So here I've defined this $P, which is a wrapped element, and regular P, this is the unwrapped version that for some reason I had. So first thing we're keeping in mind is wrapped and unwrapped. So now let's talk about what we can okay, so that's one way that you can get a wrapped element. The other thing that you can do is you can just use CSS selectors. So you use $, and inside you put a string, and that string is a CSS selector, and it'll return a wrapped version of all matching elements on the page. So here, if I want access to that copyright element, one easy way that I can do that is just by writing a CSS selector that matches it. I know this is a paragraph with a class of copyright. So p.copyright finds all of those elements on the page. This is convenient because if you want to do you're writing your HTML. In your HTML, you've tried to use semantic tag names, and you've also tried to add classes where necessary for styling. So most likely there's a convenient HTML element that gives you access to whatever you want on the page. So for example, if we zoom out of this, back in on this one, and zoom out of this page, you will see that we've got all of these little API documentation cards, you might call them. And if I go in my browser, I can see that this is an article element, and it seems to have a class of post. It looks like all of them have a class of post. So if I want to find all of these on the page, I can do. And so that gives me access to however many of these there are. I suppose there are 350 of them on the page. And then I can do various things with them. So like, I don't know, remove them all. Or you could add HTML, or you could add event handlers for it. So this is the other thing that we are typically doing, to select elements on the page. We're going to select elements on the page, and then we're going to modify them. So most common method is you'll use a CSS selector, or you could also, if for some reason you have an unwrapped element, we'll see cases later today where that happens, you can wrap it using the $sign. You can also use the $sign function to create new elements. So if you put some HTML syntax inside the quotes, then it'll create a new element. That element isn't yet attached anywhere on the page, but there are methods that attach it. So just to summarize, the point of running JavaScript on a web page is so that you can make various modifications to the web page when users do certain actions. And the first step to doing that is we need to get access to the object on the page that we want to modify. And we've got a couple of ways to do it. Most common, CSS selector. Sometimes you have an unwrapped element. We'll see cases of that. You can wrap it, or you can also create new elements, for example, to insert into the page. There I am. See if there are questions. Maybe not. Let's keep rolling. Now let's look at when we'll want to do this. We'll typically want to have JavaScript do something in response to some user action. So like the user clicks on a button, the page responds in a certain way. So we'll want to run JavaScript when, say, a button is clicked, a link is clicked, a form is submitted, maybe when the user moves the mouse or types onto the page or something like that. This means that we typically, like when you have a normal program, you think of the program starting and then running until you turn it off. In JavaScript, we don't think this way, that the browser is the thing that runs continuously, and then it calls JavaScript functions when events of interest happen. So the way we set up our JavaScript is we add these event handlers. We tell the browser, hey, when the user clicks on this link, do a certain thing. So let's look at how we do this. Here I've got a tiny little bit of JQuery code that adds an event handler. And I want to step through it because there's a lot going on. The first thing we have here is the $sign function applied to some CSS selector. So this is selecting some set of elements on the page. Let's say one element on the page. It's selecting a button with ID do sort. So you can imagine maybe there's a button that sorts the things on the page. Like maybe you click on a table header and it like sorts the table. I've seen these before. So maybe the first thing we want to do is select this button. And this returns a JQuery, right? Then we call the .on method. The .on method is what installs an event handler. So we're saying when there is a click event on these selected elements, call this callback function. You'll recall from yesterday that this is the syntax for an inline function definition, or I call them arrow functions. So this is a function, it takes an argument e, and then it does some stuff. So let's see this actually run in the browser. Let's go here. And got rid of my button. I probably refreshed. Let's put the button back. Or let's just find a link. Let's find something nice on the page to click on. Yeah, find this guy. So here we have a link inside an H2 with a class of logo. And I want to make it so that when you click on this, something happens. So do that. First, I want a link inside an H2 with a class of logo. And you can see I ran this and I successfully selected a single A tag. So that looks good. Now I can call .on and say that I want to do something when this element is clicked on. And what I'm passing here is an arrow function. So here, this is a method of this object. It takes two arguments, a string for the event type and a callback function. Here, I have begun defining that callback function. So what do I want to do when this is clicked on? Let's go with something super simple. I'm going to call a function alert. This just makes a pop-up box appear. Never in your life would you actually do it in a real website, but it's convenient for demonstration. So I'm going to run this code. Nothing is going to happen. The reason nothing happened is because all this did is it installed an event handler. It requested that the browser call this function when the user clicks on the link. I haven't clicked on the link yet, so function is not called. Now I'm going to come over here. I'm going to click on the link. And now there's a pop-up. I can't see it in the back, but it says hello in super, super, super tiny text. So there's this two-step process for running JavaScript. I mean, the JavaScript, you first run this JavaScript, which installs the event handler. Then later, the user does some action, which triggers the event handler, and then the code inside is run. If you've written JavaScript before, this is probably not very interesting. But if you haven't, this is a pretty different way of running programs. But, you know, like, it's fairly similar to how GUIs are done in like Swing or something. You probably already there. Yes?
Is there a way to do like handlers for things that aren't like events like clicking or hovering, but like a change in the state of the web page?
Why would the state change?
Like if you change the page or you change the user and the JavaScript runs off that.
The only way the page would change is either you run some JavaScript code or the user does some actions. So there's a lot of actions, right? So if I want, I could do hover, which I believe is called mouse move. And here I can, let's not do alert, that'll be too annoying, but I can do. And if I do this, then you see that this code is being run as I move my mouse, but not run when I'm not moving my mouse over that element. Is there a question? Okay. I don't know, sometimes I see movement out of my peripheral vision. Okay. So this is typically what we'll be doing in our JavaScript code. We will be finding elements, we will be attaching event handlers, and then we'll want to run some kind of code when the event handler is triggered. A little more detail on these event handlers. You might have noticed that the event handler is passed an argument, usually called E. We call this the event object. There's a bunch of possible things in the event object. So for example, that mouse move object has X and Y fields. We can actually maybe print them. Hover. Let's do that. So now as I hover, like that. There you go. So you can see here that I'm getting these. You're getting 3 prints every time I move my mouse because I've added 3 different event handlers. But you can see this one is printing the X position as I move it. So that event handler has various bits of information, like here offset X. But the most important part of the event handler is typically this e.target object. That's the actual element that triggered the event. The reason this matters is because here you might select a whole bunch of elements. And then over here, you'll want to know which specific, you'll attach the event handler on all of them. And then you'll want to do something with the specific one that someone clicked on. So we can show an example of that. We can select all the article.post elements. That's all of these gray boxes. We could say on mouse move, event handler. And then here we will do, let's do something like console.log. You are hovering over e.target. So didn't do anything yet. And then as I start hovering over these, you will see it start to tell me which element I am hovering over. Note that it doesn't tell me the article.post I'm hovering over. It's telling me the specific element that actually triggered that mouse move. Yes.
You can have multiple event handlers for one event.
Yeah.
I don't know which one to run first.
First one you attach runs first. Basically, don't rely on that. Okay, so here, the reason that I can see, Here I ran one block of code. This attached the mouse move handler to a whole bunch of elements, the 350 that match article.post. And then inside the event handler, I know which one I am actually hovering over by looking at the event target. And one thing I want to note is that here I use the $ to wrap e.target. This is one of those inconvenient places where e.target is a HTML element object, a browser native event, and I'm wrapping it so that I can do JQuery stuff on it. So here, for example, I might want to use like the JQuery API.text, which you've already seen. And now you can see that it is telling me the specific text that I am hovering over as I move my cursor. Okay, questions so far about event handlers? I know this is kind of a bunch of disparate things you're seeing, but hopefully it is starting to come together. We've got these event handlers and these jQuery objects. Yes.
This might be beyond the scope of the class, but I feel like it might not be. When you scroll to the bottom of the site, is there a way to like with those sites that refresh on their own?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Is that complicated or?
I
I assume that's some kind of.
don't off the top of my head know the events, but we can look it up. Yeah, look at that. So let's try it. On roll. Define event handler. And I don't really know what's in the event object, so here I'm just going to log it to the console. Okay, so now as I scroll, it's generating these scroll events. Yep. I also hovered over something. That was kind of annoying. Oh my goodness. Yeah, there we go. Here's our scroll events. And yeah. Okay. I guess it doesn't tell you where you are. You just kind of read that off the page. So you can do. Is it no? I haven't had to write one of those. Window.scroll line. Okay. Sure. Cool. So then there's probably a way to get window. Okay, in our height. Cool. So you can imagine putting together a little thing like, okay, I'm going to switch to the text editor for this. Everyone see that in the back? Cool. So I suppose you would write something like document.on scroll. And then you have and you'd probably do something like if for position greater than max position minus 2000 pixels. So we'll see how to do that Monday. And then we probably do something like I don't know, main. Yeah, let's say get some kind of more stuff, and then we do and yeah, so you can do a little event handler like this. So here I am reacting to the scroll events and checking how far down the page I have scrolled. And then, you know, if I scroll too close to the bottom, I'll like append more stuff. And presumably these are keep scrolling. Now the inner height and the scroll height have changed. but then if the user gets close to the bottom of the page, I'll run this again. So yeah, you do it like this. Other questions about event handling? Okay, we're gonna cover some more kind of ingredients, and then we're gonna put these ingredients together to make a little JavaScript widget. Okay, so far we've looked at how to add event handlers. And just a couple of things to keep in mind about events. First of all, a lot of events have default behaviors. So for example, if you click on a link, what the button will do, what the browser will do by default is go to the page that the link links to. So there's a method you could call prevent default, and this method stops the browser from doing the default event. There's also this thing called event bubbling. Basically, if you hover over an element, you're also hovering over its parent, right? And it's the parent, and it's the parent. So this is what bubbling does. It bubbles up from children to parents. And there's a stop propagation function. I don't really need you to remember this, but this is important. So for example, hey, let's build a kind of useless JavaScript. Okay, let's build kind of useless, but actual bit of JavaScript. I'm going to make it so that if you click this link to go back to the main page, it doesn't work unless you scroll down a little bit. I don't know why you want this, but it's something that you can do. So let's try to build this. We already remember that that element is h2.logo, and I want to react to the user clicking on it. So here's my first bit. I'm attaching an event handler to run when you click on that link. And now I want to check if you scroll down. So we recently established that that involves checking the scroll line. So if you scrolled a bit, then you're okay. But if you have not yet scrolled anything, we want to do prevent default. And just to make it easier on us, let's add a console.log here. Allow and click. And I'm going to add one here. And let's close out our event handler. So now if I scroll to the top of the page and click on this, you see that it called e.preventDefault and it said preventing click. But if I scroll a little bit down the page, it is allowed to click. And that's again because we added an event handler to do something on click, and it prevents the default action, which is following the link, in certain cases, otherwise it doesn't. Okay. Okay, so now we've talked about adding event handlers, so running code when the user does something. Now let's talk about modifying the page in response. So jQuery has a lot of APIs for modifying the web page, and these are all methods on jQuery objects. They're all pretty intuitive. So for example, there's an append and a prepend function, and that allows you to add elements either at the end or the beginning of an HTML element. So for example, here we've got this list of menu items, and it looks like it's an element with ID menu top. So we can select the element with ID menu top. Then we can append. Let's see how these actually look in practice. So these are LIs with classes of menu item, and then they contain links inside. Great. So let's add one of our own. Class equals menu item. Cool. So I'm going to run this code, and you see that it popped up a menu item. I guess it's not white because I didn't add the anchor element. Let's see if that fixes it. Yeah, cool. So you can see I ran some code and modified the web page. And if I wanted to, I could do this inside an event handler. So we're going to make it so that when you click on a logo, it adds a button. So let's take this code and put it right here. And let's also prevent the default action so that we don't leave the page afterward. Okay, and now every time I click on this link, it is adding another element to the page. Yeah, I mean, this looks kind of dumb, but you would want to add a useful element to the page instead of a useless one, and then it would be useful. Okay, so that's one thing that you can do. Append and prepend, that adds a child, either the first or last child. There's also before or after that adds a sibling. So these work fairly similarly. There are add class and remove class methods. This is convenient because you will often want to do something like show or hide a drop-down menu. And the way you will probably want to do that is you'll want to have a class called like .open, where if it's .open, the menu is displayed, and if otherwise by default it's not shown. And then you can do something like onClick, add the class, or remove the class, whichever it may be. There's also these remove and replace methods if you want to remove an element from the page. These are convenient for forms, so the val method changes the value, the adder method changes the attribute, and .text you've seen me use give you the text contents. And the way a lot of these methods down here work is that if you save this, let's just select the first paragraph. So here I selected the first paragraph. If you call the method with no arguments, it gives the current value. So here, span out the contents. And if you instead call it with an argument, it replaces that value with the. So similarly, I could, the current classes, I guess none. Then add an element. And you'll see here, in the first case, I selected all the paragraphs on the page and checked what classes they have. There aren't any classes they have in common. Here I overwrote all of their classes to say the word hello. So now all of those P elements have hello classes. Yes?
You said overrode, you truly overrode or just added?
Overrode. Yeah, there's also add class and remove class if you specifically want to add a class. So if I wanted to, but those don't have this like call it once with one versus two arguments. Okay, so we have a bunch of APIs for modifying the page. They're fairly straightforward. You can create elements, you can remove them, you can modify. And yeah, so let me skip a few APIs, we'll get back to them, and just walk through an example of actually using this. So here I've got a somewhat complicated bit of JavaScript written, and the goal of this code is to check that your password satisfies certain requirements, namely that it is at least 8 characters long, and it's not all word characters, so all alphanumeric. So let me kind of just step through this bit of code, and then we'll play with it a little bit in the browser. So the first thing that I've got here is I've selected all of the inputs on the page that are inside of a form. And I'm asking to run an event handler on the key down event. That's the event that runs when you type a letter. So I have this code executing every time you type into a text box. So what's it doing? The first thing that it's doing is it is finding the form that this input element is in. Remember that the target of the event is an input element. So we want to find the closest form, and this method .closest walks up from this element to the first ancestor that matches that selector. So I've gone up from the input element to the form. And then inside that input element, I'm going to find another input element whose name is equal to password. This syntax with the square brackets, it's actually standard in CSS, but you don't have to memorize it here. And then we'll get that password input. We'll get the value of the input at the moment. And then we have a bunch of tests on it, right? So we're checking, is the current password field less than 8 characters in length, or is it all alphanumeric? This match thing is regexes. If you're not familiar with them, not super important. And then if either of those is true, either case of bad password is true, we're going to find the output element inside the form and add some text to it. In other words, we're going to show an error message. Yes?
So the dollar signs on the front of your variable names, is that just
That's
a personal indicator to know?
Yes, so yeah, exactly. So again, you're often like one unfortunate aspect of using jQuery is you have both jQuery objects that are good and also regular browser objects which are bad. And to keep track of which is which, I'm putting a dollar sign. Yes.
So the target is returning the input in the form that like triggered
That
it,
triggered the key down.
and you're trying to go from that to find the form that was in.
That's right. Yeah, so let's actually try to execute this step by step. I'm gonna grab this code and stick it in my text editor of choice. That seems to have messed up my indentation, but we'll fix it. Yeah, like that. And like this, and then like that. Or, yeah, okay, cool. So I have this function, I'm gonna save it as for password.js. I just realized these are probably yes. Oh my god, you update software when you're not looking and suddenly. Okay, I realize I gotta fix all the strings to be properly quoted. Okay. So let's save this JavaScript and let's use it on a web page. So let's create a new file and make a web page that we can use this in. Form. Maybe I'm going to tell it not to submit anywhere. And it's going to have an input for the username, an input for the password. Might as well make this type equals password. I believe I actually called it PWD. Okay. Okay, I made a little form for it to use. We can save this as form password HTML. And maybe to make this look a little less ugly, we can do and here. Okay. Okay, so I defined a little HTML form. Let's actually open that in my browser. I do not actually know how to do that. Let's just do this. Okay, so here's my little HTML form. And now I want to make sure to run my JavaScript code. So let's include it on the page. You will recall that we're gonna do that using source equals form password.js. And we're also gonna want to include JQuery, which no. And let's say I had a put this one. Trying to remember the URL for JQuery. I'm just gonna steal it from say. Cool. All right, let's try again. So we have run our code. And I have a missing friend after arguments. Let's fix that. Good. Okay. Is that executing anything? Well, let's find out by using the browser debugger tools. So I'm going to open my file and let's start by seeing if it's loaded. So I can see that we get to this point as the page is loading. So you can see the page is blank because this runs as the page is loading. And the first thing I can ask is whether there is a form input. No, that's because I forgot to tell the browser to run this only once the page is loaded. So let's do that. Okay, so now I refreshed again. You can see that now the page is actually loaded. So when we execute this, well, it's still not doing anything. So let's check whether form input exists. It does seem to exist. So now let's move our breakpoint inside the function and see if this is ever actually called. So it is being called. All right, so now let's kind of step through this. We can go a little bit and ask, did we find a form? We did. Did we find a password input field? We also did. Okay, let's keep executing. We are now inside this error handling case. But probably what's going to happen, I now realize the error, is that we're not going to find an output element to actually put our error message in. So let's add one. And while we're here, we might as well add a style. Output. And maybe let's also make the all right. So let's try again. I'm gonna turn off the breakpoints. And as I type, you can see it's saying bad password, and it's going to keep saying that until, oh, now this is triggering even when I have a password. Right. That's probably because. So this triggers here because the password's length is too short. Check that here. Password value's length is 0. We let it keep running. Turn this off for a moment so I can actually type. Now, if we turn this back on, you see this is still running. Let's see why. The length of password form is 12, so that's good. But the regex matches because it's looking for a substring match. That's fixable. All right. Again. So far this is a bad password. But now this should be good, and we aren't running this, but we're not clearing the error handling code. So otherwise, let's do that. Okay. Turn this off. Okay, so now I can type into here, it'll say that password. Still not working. Let's find out what's up with that. Okay, I'm calling .text. What I want to do is pass it an empty argument to actually replace the text. Let's try this again. Okay, cool. So now you can see that the error message goes away once and then reappears once I stop satisfying that requirement. So we did a little bit of debugging. Let's review the code. Again, we are attaching an event handler that fires when I type into any input field. And that is finding the form, finding the password input in the form, and then either clearing or adding an error message. Questions? I feel like I see people looking lost. Okay, people laughed at that. All right. That's not good.
I think you might just be like.
That's fine. That's fine. Let's do another one. Let's do a sorter. Okay. Let's write some more JavaScript. That's probably the thing that will help you the most. So let's make a list of, I don't know, fruit. Bite me. I gotta go for questionable fruits, okay? Yeah, all right. So we got a little list of fruit here. I want to make a button so that when you click it, it sorts them. So let's view the page. We got a list here, and we got a button. And if you click on the button, it doesn't do anything because we haven't made it do anything. So let's get started making some HTML that's actually going some JavaScript that's actually going to sort the list when you click the button. All right. So first things first, we need to do something when the user clicks a button. So let's select the button and do something on click. And for now, let's just print something to the screen when the user clicks the button. Try this. It works. Every time I click, it says something in the console. Okay. The next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to sort all the list items. So the first thing we need is we need all the list items. So here I've used a selector, the li selector, to select all the list item elements. Okay, so every time you click, you see it's printing a list of all the list items. Next thing we need to do is we need to sort these items. So let's remind ourselves how sort works. You see that it's a method on arrays. And you can call it with a comparison function. So let's do that. First, we'll need turn this into an array. So remember that jQuery is one of these array-like objects. So I'm going to turn it into a proper array so that I can call sort. Then I want to sort this array. And we'll print it after the sort. we got a problem. So let's look what that is. Arrays is not defined, that's because it's array, right? Yeah. Here. Okay, so we are getting our array back. And hopefully it's sorted, but is it really? Let's just check. So let's log each one. So just to follow what's going on here, I used a jQuery selector here to get a jQuery object for all of the list items on the page. I then convert that to a native JavaScript array of HTML elements. I sort it. I iterate over it. Note that I'm using for of loops. That's one of the good ones. It's not for in, which is the bad one. And then here, I might as well call this li. Since over here I turned this into a native array, it now contains native elements, so I wrap them again so I can call .text. So let's try this. Okay, so now when I click it, I do get all the objects printed. They're not quite printed in the correct order though, and that's because I need to tell it how to sort things. So I can probably do that like this. If A is less than B, 1 equals B, 0, else all cases. Okay. Unexpected. Which one? Ah, yes. JavaScript, it's else. I think your Python is a weird one. Still does not work. Let's check how the sort works. The return value where. Okay, let's check how this works in the. I mean, maybe it's not a bad call. Let's use a triple equal sign just to check. Okay, so now when I call sort, expand this out. It's comparing A and B, which are HTML elements. You can see here li. But what I really want to compare is A.text. Purdue. All right, let's try this again. Okay, so now we are getting correct sorting. A, B, C. Hopefully these are correct. All right, folks, okay. Okay, so now again, trying to follow this, we start with a jQuery object. We convert it to a native one using array.from. Then when we sort it, we have to wrap things back so that we can call .text on them. So now we have this sorted array of objects. And now we should be able to insert them in order back into the unordered list. So I'm going to select the unordered list. Actually, let's do this. Yes. Take the unordered list, and I'm going to get them first to last. So I want to append each of them. So I'm going to append. So again, here I've named it li because it does not have the $sign. I'm reminded that it's a native object, so I wrap it here. Let's try this. Hey. So now clicking on this sorts it. And you can even add a little bit of state to this. So you can say let current order equals 0. And then here, I could say if current order is 0. One. Let's sort it. And otherwise, we can sort it in the reverse order. And we can sort it in the reverse order by just switching the negative ones for ones. And then every time we click, we can switch the current order. If the current order is unordered or current order is reverse. And make it sorted. Else. So now, hopefully, when you, oh, no, it just doesn't work at all. That's because I gotta move this up here. Now, hopefully, when you click it, it switches from being sorted backwards.
Are you
Preset, I can.
Yes, yeah, sorry, it's displaying these kind of funky, like triple in both directions, equal signs. Yeah, this is just 3 equal signs in a row. So this is again checking without doing thing.
In your for loop, could you just wrap it in like the, instead of in the append, could you just wrap it in line 28 for let li?
Like this,
Yeah.
that's a cool idea, but no, you can't. Nah, sorry. One thing I could do though, actually, what I could do, I could turn the whole array into a JQuery object. And then this might work correctly. I'm not 100% confident it will. Yes.
Would you do this over just doing more in the controller?
Well, imagine if I wanted to do this in the controller. Then when I click this button, it'd have to submit a request to my controller, which would have to regenerate the page, but like sort it a different way. And then send the result back. So 2 flaws, right? Like one problem is that it'd take a while, especially if you're like on a mobile network or you have a bad connection or something, right? It's also increasing load on your server. Now your server is doing this work of like sorting. So it's kind of worse for you and it's worse for the user. The user gets longer latency and response times are worse. And what you get is more load on your server. Now, like, obviously the downside is this is like in some way more complicated. You're running code on the client. There's now 2 programming languages involved. It's unfortunate. But you could have like, it can be very convenient to do things on the client side, especially if you're, serving users over like a slow mobile network. Yeah, I mean, maybe to put it a simple way, let's see how long it takes for me to click on this button. All right, so I've recorded a profile. And if we zoom in over here, we'll see the 1 frame where it got sorted. And if we keep zooming in over here, we can see how long that took. So I've zoomed in about as far as it'll allow me. And somewhere in here, I assume one of these events, which I literally can't zoom to any further, my apologies, is the one where I do a click. And then it runs some JavaScript, and then this is the browser redrawing the web page. And we can see that all told, from me starting the click to me finishing the click was 300 microseconds, which is pretty good. It's definitely a lot longer than it would take your computer to check whether you are connected to the internet, let alone like do a full request response cycle. And we can actually see how long the request response cycle is if I just hit record and then refresh. So now I can narrow in to
Do you ever want to like build a website from scratch using just JavaScript?
Yeah, this is what, okay, just JavaScript doesn't quite work, right? Because the server exists to store state across different requests and across different users. So if you have a website that like doesn't have a server at all, then presumably different users can't talk to each other, right? In which case your website is like, I don't know, like a Word document. Which is fine, right? If you want to work on it, it's okay. But typically what you have is you have a backend, but the trend these days has been to do more and more in the browser in JavaScript, because you have this advantage of only talking to the server when you need to, and otherwise having low latency response to anything the user does. So, doing a lot in the front end makes a lot of sense.
I have a different question.
Okay.
Maybe we'll talk about this, but like, this seems like it could be a security thing. Like, I know
Yeah.
client side.
Yeah, that's right. So so in general, we can't trust anything that's happening on the client, right? But like sorting, I don't need to trust that the client does it correctly, right? Presumably, if I have an evil hacker user who has modified their browser to sort the stuff correctly, and their punishment is the stuff is sorted incorrectly, like on their computer, I don't know. That's fine, right? You can see this in like real world web pages as well. So let's like search Wikipedia world population by country. I'm picking this web page because it's got a big table. So presumably when I loaded this page, there's a controller on the Wikipedia backend whose job is to draw this page. And then I can go here and I can just like keep clicking this button. And if each of these made a request to Wikipedia, that would maybe be bad. Wikipedia serves a lot of people, including bored high schoolers who are just doing this all the way through class. Maybe some of you are doing this right now. But conveniently, this is all happening on the front end. So first of all, it's basically instantaneous. We can actually do the same test to see how much faster this is. Let's do it. Record the page, sort. We can see that the sorting happened here. You can see that there was a click event, which called a function. Probably called more functions, like anonymous function, append to table, build cache, etc. So we can see that this whole cycle of clicking on the page to sort it ran from like about 1320 milliseconds to about 1400, so about 80 milliseconds. If I refresh the page, we can see that this took approximately from 146 to about 300 milliseconds. Right. So, and this is fundamental. Just like talking to another website across the internet, somewhere else in the world, is going to be a lot slower than something that happens directly on your computer. I don't know why I started doing this. I feel like I didn't from the beginning of class. Yeah, probably something. All right. Let's do another one of these because we've got about 15 minutes and this seems like a good use of time. Let's go back to our HTML. I'm going to do another form example. And in this one, I'm going to do one of those forms where you have to type your password twice in front of it. Now, what's interesting about this type your password twice situation is that it's not clear that I actually need this on the server side. So, but this is like a user interface, right? Make sure the user typed their password correctly. So I'm going to create two input elements here and a button to submit. Naturally, in real life, there'd be like a username field as well. But for now. So here we got our two fields. And now I want to make it so that anytime the user types, we check whether or not those are the same. So let's do it. We're going to need to act anytime the user types in an input field whose type is password. So that's my first step. I'm going to select those two elements. And just so that you all can follow along, we can test that code here. You can see that it selects both of my input fields. I want to do something every time the user types. That one's called key down. And what do I want to check? Well, I think I want to check that I want to first find the two password input fields. So I can probably just do this like this. Okay, and I want to check if they have the same contents. So inputs EQ0. This EQ just means get the first, get the second, etc. Dot val. So every time the user types, get both input fields, check that they have the same value, and then for now print the same or different. So cool. Okay. Now maybe we want to do something like this. It's a little annoying if we show the error immediately as the user types, because like when they type their password the first time, it won't match. So let's actually do something like this. So here, all I'm going to do is I'm going to update a global variable. So as I type, I can say passwords match, and they don't. Oh. Good. Hey. Let me go back here and make them not actually password entries. And in fact, instead of actually printing it, we can. There we go. Not configured. Oh yeah, because I looked for type equals password. And I just made them not type equals password. Okay. Again. Okay, I see actually after I type the first character, it says true. It must be comparing it before I type. So let's switch this to key plus. Cool. So now it's setting this variable, and then I can make sure that the user doesn't submit the form if the passwords don't match. So here I'm going to say if not passwords match, e.prevent default. That stops the browser from submitting the form. And maybe I should add an output here. And then I could do cool. So let's try it. I'm typing, and when I click submit, it will annoy me and say passwords don't match, and it didn't let me submit. If I keep typing until the passwords match, now I'm allowed to submit. So here I used 2 different event handlers and a little piece of state. And the piece of state kind of communicates between the event handlers. This one checks if the passwords match and sets the variable. This one uses that variable to determine whether I should be allowed to submit.
How much do you put in a single Java file, like a JavaScript file?
What do you want?
Like how many of these can you put in a single one versus making another file?
It's kind of up to you how you want to organize it. Typically what people do is they will, once these get pretty long, move them into a named function. So what I might do is do something like this. Function, that's not right. I shouldn't be looking over my shoulder. Check passwords, match, E. And then here, instead of passing an inline function, I can say check password match. And here I can say check, allow, submit. You know, how big exactly you want them to be, or how you organize them into files, you know, just like anything is kind of entirely. And you see that once we've done this, we've really got JavaScript back to this sort of typical state where a JavaScript file defines a bunch of functions and maybe some state. And then at the end of the file, sets up those functions to be called when the user takes certain things. Okay. Any further questions?
Do you not meet the tax use of those functions in the calls or like?
These are functions, here, this is a function name.
Okay,
So I'm naming which function we should call when the event occurs.
I see.
Did you interview people when you worked at Dropbox?
Yes,
What was
so I
like,
worked on backend, so
what was like your for,
that's
like,
probably an after class question.
okay, that'd be interesting, yeah.
Okay, all right, folks. So today we spoke a little bit of jQuery. We wrote a couple of jQuery handlers. You're going to be doing a lot of stuff like these handlers, including sorting stuff for your homework 6. And I will see all of you on Monday, where we'll talk about making network requests from JavaScript.